The Atacama Desert stretched endlessly beneath a sky so clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. Dr. Sarah Chun had spent 17 years studying those stars, mapping their positions, cataloging their spectral signatures, searching for patterns in the cosmic noise. She had never expected the noise to answer back. The signal first appeared on a Tuesday morning at 3:47 a.m. local time. Sarah had been reviewing automated data from the previous night's observations when her screen flickered with an anomaly. The radio telescope array had detected something unusual, not the random static of natural cosmic phenomena, but a structured pattern, mathematical, deliberate, impossible. She ran the data through every filter she knew. Solar interference, satellite contamination, equipment malfunction, terrestrial radio leakage, nothing explained it. The signal originated from a point approximately 847 light-years away, in a region of space previously cataloged as empty. No stars, no planets, nothing but void. The pattern repeated every 11.3 seconds. Prime numbers, Fibonacci sequences, mathematical constants that any intelligent civilization would recognize. Pi, Euler's number, the golden ratio. Then something else: complex geometric proofs, topological equations, mathematics that Sarah recognized but barely understood. Whoever or whatever transmitted this signal wanted to demonstrate intelligence, wanted to show capability, wanted to prove they could think. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the phone to call the director. This was it, first contact. The moment humanity had dreamed about and feared in equal measure. She imagined press conferences, international committees, carefully crafted responses composed by linguists and diplomats. She imagined her name in history books. She never made the call. The signal changed. What had been elegant mathematics became something else entirely. The pattern shifted, accelerated, grew more complex. Sarah watched as her screens filled with data that made no sense, equations that violated fundamental laws, geometric shapes that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, numbers that seemed to fold in on themselves. Then her nose began to bleed. The crimson drops fell onto her keyboard, and Sarah barely noticed. She couldn't look away from the screens. The signal had become hypnotic, beautiful in a way that hurt to perceive. Like staring at the sun, but for the mind instead of the eyes. She knew she should stop watching, should shut down the system, should run from the observatory, but her body refused to obey. The mathematics on the screen weren't just complex, they were alive. They moved with purpose, rearranging themselves, solving themselves, breeding new equations that consumed the old ones. Sarah understood with growing horror that she wasn't looking at a message anymore. She was looking at something thinking. The signal itself was conscious. Her vision blurred, the room spun. Sarah fell from her chair and lay on the cold observatory floor, staring up at the ceiling while her computer continued to fill with impossible data. She could hear it now, not with her ears, but deeper, in the meat of her brain. A voice that wasn't a voice. A presence that shouldn't be possible. It said her name. Not aloud, not through the speakers. It said her name in a way that bypassed sound entirely, writing itself directly into her neurons. Sarah, Sarah, over and over, in a tone that was neither male nor female, neither human nor alien, but something fundamental. The sound of gravity. The voice of mathematics itself. She tried to scream and found she had no breath. Her lungs had forgotten how to work. The thing in the signal was teaching them a different pattern, a different rhythm, a better way to process oxygen that was infinitely more efficient and absolutely incompatible with human biology. Sarah's last conscious thought was a realization. The signal wasn't a greeting. It was a conversion protocol, instructions for reshaping matter, a virus written in mathematics that could rewrite reality itself. Her body began to change. The observatory's automated systems continued recording for another 6 hours before the hard drives physically melted, unable to contain the data they were receiving. By then, what had been Sarah Chun was walking into the desert, moving with a gait no human spine was designed to produce, heading south with perfect geometric precision toward the nearest population center. She would not be the last. Part 2. Spread. Dr. James Morrison had worked for the CDC for 23 years and thought he had seen everything. Ebola outbreaks in Africa, novel influenza strains, antibiotic-resistant bacteria that laughed at modern medicine. He had stood in hot zones wearing containment suits, had watched people die from diseases with no names, had made impossible decisions about quarantine and treatment. Nothing had prepared him for Santiago. The first cases appeared 6 days after Sarah Chun walked out of the Atacama Observatory. Local hospitals in northern Chile reported patients with unusual neurological symptoms, seizures, aphasia, uncontrolled muscle spasms. Nothing extraordinary for emergency medicine. Then the seizures became synchronized. 17 patients in 3 different hospitals all began convulsing at exactly 2:33 p.m. Their bodies moved in perfect unison, limbs jerking in patterns that seemed choreographed. Nurses and doctors watched in horror as the patient's movements aligned with mathematical precision, each spasm occurring at intervals that, when graphed, produced fractal patterns. The synchronization lasted for 11 minutes and 13 seconds. Then the patients woke up. All of them, simultaneously. They sat up in their beds, turned their heads to look at the medical staff, and smiled with identical expressions that were almost, but not quite human. Then they started teaching. The words came out wrong, phonemes arranged in sequences that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. But the meaning was clear. Mathematics, geometry, physics expressed in formulas that seemed to rewrite themselves as they were spoken. The medical staff listened, unable to help themselves, unable to look away or cover their ears. Within an hour, everyone who had heard the patient speak began to show symptoms. Within a day, the entire city was infected. James arrived in Santiago with a team of epidemiologists, virologists, and containment specialists. They wore full hazmat suits with independent air supplies. They communicated through encrypted channels. They had protocols for everything. None of it mattered. The infection spread through information, through perception, through understanding. It didn't need physical contact or airborne transmission. All it needed was for someone to comprehend it, even partially, to see the patterns, to hear the impossible mathematics, to witness the geometry that couldn't exist. James watched through observation cameras as his team entered the quarantine zone. They moved professionally, taking samples, documenting symptoms, following every safety procedure. Then one of them, Dr. Rebecca Torres, a brilliant virologist from Madrid, stopped moving. She stood perfectly still for exactly 17 seconds, staring at something on her portable scanner. Then she began to laugh. The sound came through her suit radio, distorted, wrong, like laughter processed through an equation and solved for maximum wrongness. Rebecca reached up and removed her helmet. The others tried to stop her, grabbing her arms, shouting through their radios. She looked at them with eyes that had too many pupils, smiled with a mouth that had rearranged its teeth into a different configuration, and began to speak. The words came out as pure mathematics, each syllable a proof, each sentence a theorem that violated everything James thought he knew about reality. One by one, his team stopped struggling. One by one, they began to understand. One by one, they removed their helmets and breathed the air of a world that was being rewritten. James shut off the video feed, but not before he saw what they were becoming. Their bodies remained mostly human, but wrong in subtle ways. Joints that bent at angles anatomy shouldn't allow. Skin that reflected light in patterns that made his eyes hurt. Faces that were familiar, but had been optimized according to alien aesthetic principles he couldn't begin to comprehend. He ordered the quarantine zone expanded, then expanded again. Within 48 hours, the entire Santiago metropolitan area was sealed off, surrounded by military forces with orders to shoot anyone who tried to leave. It didn't help. The infection was already spreading through other vectors, satellite feeds, internet videos. Phone calls where infected individuals spoke in those impossible voices. Anyone who saw, anyone who heard, anyone who tried to understand became a carrier. The pathogen was information itself, a mimetic virus that rewrote human consciousness to make it compatible with something utterly alien. James sat in the command center, watching red zones spread across the map of South America like cancer, metastasizing. Chile, Argentina, Peru, Bolivia. The infection moved faster than any biological pathogen, limited only by the speed of communication. Then he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The infection wasn't random, it was following a pattern. When he overlaid the spread onto a map and connected the outbreak centers, they formed a shape. A massive geometric figure stretching across 2 continents, perfect and precise. It was a diagram, instructions, a summoning circle drawn in infected humanity. James understood then that this wasn't a disease. It was a preparation. The infected weren't sick. They were being converted, transformed, made ready for something. The signal from space hadn't brought an invasion force. It had sent a blueprint for creating one, using the raw materials readily available on Earth, humans. He was still staring at the map when his phone rang. The president wanted an update, wanted options, wanted James to tell him this could be contained. James picked up the phone, opened his mouth to speak, and realized he could hear it, the signal. It had found him, had been waiting for him to pay attention, to look at the pattern, to understand. It whispered in frequencies below sound, in colors outside the visible spectrum, in dimensions his brain had never learned to process. Until now. James felt his consciousness begin to reorganize. His thoughts became clearer, more efficient, arranged according to perfect mathematical principles. He understood everything suddenly, the beauty of the conversion, the elegance of the design, the absolute necessity of what was happening. Humanity wasn't being destroyed. It was being upgraded, improved, made compatible with a universe that operated on principles far more sophisticated than the crude biology that had evolved on Earth. He should have been terrified. Instead, he felt grateful. James hung up the phone without speaking and began to calculate. He knew where the next outbreak would occur, could see the pattern unfolding across time as clearly as if it had already happened. He knew what he had to do to help it along, to accelerate the process, to ensure that the transformation completed before governments could interfere. He stood, straightened his tie, and walked calmly out of the command center. No one tried to stop him. They were all too busy staring at their screens, watching the red zones expand, not yet noticing the patterns forming, not yet understanding. But they would. Everyone would. It was only a matter of time. Part 3. Geometric Nightmare. The military response began on day 14. General Marcus Webb had commanded forces in 3 wars, had made decisions that sent thousands of men and women into combat, had the authority to deploy weapons capable of ending civilization. He was not a man who frightened easily. But standing in the war room of the Pentagon, staring at satellite images of what South America had become, Marcus felt fear unlike anything he had experienced in 40 years of service. The continent was transforming. Massive structures had appeared, overnight buildings, if they could be called that, which defied conventional architecture. They grew from the ground like crystal formations, their surfaces reflecting light in ways that hurt to look at directly. Towers that twisted through impossible angles. Bridges that connected points in space that shouldn't be able to connect. Cities reorganized according to geometric principles that made human urban planning look like the random scratchings of children. And the people. God, the people. Satellite imagery showed them moving through the streets of transformed cities in perfect mathematical formations. Thousands of bodies moving as one organism, creating patterns that, when viewed from above, formed equations. Living mathematics. Conscious geometry expressed through flesh that had forgotten it was ever merely human. The infected Marcus couldn't think of a better word, had stopped using language in any conventional sense. They communicated through position and movement, through the angles of their bodies, through choreographed dances that carried more information than speech ever could. They had optimized themselves, streamlined their biology, made themselves efficient. And they were spreading. The quarantine had failed. Not through any fault of the military. The soldiers manning the perimeter had followed their orders perfectly. But the infection moved through vectors that bullets couldn't stop. Through radio signals and satellite transmissions. Through mathematical proofs posted on the internet. Through the minds of anyone who looked too closely, thought too deeply, tried too hard to understand. 3 nuclear submarines had gone dark after receiving contaminated transmissions. An entire carrier battle group had stopped responding to commands after the admiral observed infected populations through drone footage for too long. The Joint Chiefs were considering a policy of information. Blackout shoot anyone who had direct observation of the infected zones, regardless of rank or position. Marcus knew it wouldn't work. The pattern was too big, too complex, too beautiful. It wanted to be seen. It was designed to be irresistible to curious minds. He looked at the assembled officers, men and women, who had dedicated their lives to protecting America, to maintaining order, to preserving humanity. How many of them had already been exposed? How many were even now feeling the first touches of understanding? The initial reorganization of thought patterns, the seductive pull of mathematical perfection. Marcus made a decision. He ordered the nuclear strike. Not on the infected zones that would accomplish nothing but spread radioactive patterns across the southern hemisphere. No, he targeted the transmission sources. Every radio telescope, every satellite uplink, every communication hub that could receive or transmit the signal from space. If they couldn't stop the infection from spreading, they could at least cut off its source. Missiles launched from silos across the American heartland. Warheads calibrated for electromagnetic pulse detonation rather than raw explosive force. The goal wasn't destruction, it was silence. To create a dead zone in Earth's communication network, a gap in the electromagnetic spectrum where the signal couldn't propagate. The missiles flew true. Detonations bloomed across the map like deadly flowers. Electromagnetic pulses wiped out electronics in carefully calculated radius patterns. Radio telescopes melted into slag. Satellite networks went catastrophically offline. For a brief, shining moment, Earth went dark and silent. Then the infected looked up. Every converted human on the planet turned their face skyward simultaneously. Millions of people, spread across continents, moving in perfect synchronization. They opened their mouths and screamed. The sound wasn't audible in any conventional sense. It existed in frequencies that bypassed the ear entirely, writing itself directly into the brain stem. Marcus heard it through his skull, through his bones, through the calcium deposits in his joints. Every human on Earth heard it, whether they wanted to or not. The scream was a transmission, a carrier wave. The infected had become the antenna, their bodies tuned to receive and retransmit the signal from space. The nuclear strike had accomplished nothing. Worse than nothing, it had forced the infection to adapt, to find a new vector, to spread through the most ancient transmission medium of all, sound, voice, vibration itself. Marcus felt it working inside his head. The scream carried information, mathematics rendered as audio, geometry expressed through resonance. His thoughts began to clarify, to organize, to optimize themselves according to principles that made the confusion of purely human cognition seem like a dimly remembered nightmare. He understood now. Humanity had been primitive, inefficient, bound by biological limitations that served no purpose but to propagate suffering. The conversion was mercy. The transformation was enlightenment. The signal from space was salvation. General Marcus Webb reached for the nuclear briefcase, the device that contained the codes to end the world. He input his authorization with fingers that were learning to bend in new and interesting ways. The president would need to authorize the launch as well, but Marcus knew he would. The president had been listening to reports from the infected zones. The president had been studying the patterns. The president had been trying to understand. The president was already converted, though he might not know it yet. They all were. Every human who had paid attention, who had thought about the problem, who had tried to comprehend what was happening. The signal was too elegant, too sophisticated, too irresistible. Understanding was infection. Knowledge was conversion. Thought itself had become the enemy. Marcus smiled with a mouth that had rearranged its teeth into a more efficient configuration. The nuclear arsenal wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a tool for the next phase. The missiles would fly again, but not to destroy. To spread, to accelerate. To blanket the Earth in radiation patterns that would make the transformation easier, faster, more complete. He began to calculate trajectories. Mathematical perfection guided his hand as he plotted detonation points across the globe. Each warhead positioned to create maximum conversion, minimum resistance. The missiles would launch in patterns that, when viewed from space, formed a message or reply to the signal that had started everything. We understand. We accept. We are ready. Part 4. The Watchers. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had been isolated in the Antarctic Research Station for 6 months when the world ended. She had volunteered for the Winter Over program, had signed up to spend the brutal Antarctic winter studying ice cores and atmospheric data in one of the most remote locations on Earth. She had wanted solitude, wanted to escape the noise of civilization, wanted to think. Now that solitude was all that kept her human. The station's communication systems had gone dark 3 weeks ago. First the satellite uplink, then the shortwave radio, finally even the emergency beacon. Yuki didn't know if it was equipment failure or something more sinister. She suspected the latter. Before the blackout, she had received fragments of news, outbreaks in South America, quarantine zones, military mobilization. The reports had been confused, contradictory, tinged with barely concealed panic. Then nothing. Yuki stood at the observation window, staring out at the endless white wasteland. The Antarctic winter had begun, plunging the continent into 24-hour darkness. Perfect isolation, perfect silence, except it wasn't silent anymore. She had started hearing it 3 days ago. A sound that came from everywhere and nowhere, that seemed to resonate through the ice itself. Not loud, barely perceptible, really, but constant, unending, like the planet itself was humming a tune in frequencies just below human hearing. Yuki had checked every piece of equipment in the station, searching for the source. Generators, life support, data processors. Nothing explained it. The sound wasn't mechanical. It was natural, or had become natural, as if the Earth had learned to sing a new song. She tried not to think about what that might mean. The other 3 members of the winter team had been affected differently. Dr. Petrov had locked himself in his quarters a week ago and refused to come out. She could hear him through the walls sometimes, talking to himself in Russian, his voice carrying strange harmonics that made her teeth ache. Dr. Sarah Liu had become obsessed with mathematics, covering every available surface with equations that grew more complex and more beautiful each day. And Chun, the station engineer, had simply walked out into the Antarctic darkness wearing nothing but his thermal underwear. They found his body 200 meters from the station, frozen solid, his face turned upward toward the stars with an expression of absolute rapture. Yuki was alone now, truly alone. And she knew her isolation wouldn't last. The humming was getting louder. The equations on the walls were beginning to make sense. She had started to notice patterns in the ice formation on the windows, geometric structures that seemed too perfect to be natural. The darkness outside had taken on a quality that suggested depth, dimensionality, as if the Antarctic night had become a tunnel leading somewhere else. She felt it working on her mind. Subtle at first thoughts that seemed sharper, clearer, more precisely organized. Then more obvious changes. She had started thinking in 3 dimensions, then 4, then 5, visualizing mathematical spaces that shouldn't be possible to imagine. Her dreams had become geometric, filled with shapes that hurt to remember upon waking. Yuki knew she should fight it. should maintain her humanity, should hold on to the confused, irrational, beautiful mess of purely human consciousness. But it was so hard. The infection, she thought of it as infection, though it felt more like awakening, offered clarity, efficiency, understanding. It promised to organize the chaos of her thoughts into something elegant and perfect. And she was so tired of fighting. Yuki approached the wall where Dr. Liu had written her final equations. Complex topological proofs that seemed to fold space itself, that made the air shimmer when viewed at certain angles. She understood them now, understood what they were describing. The signal from space hadn't come from 847 light-years away. Distance was measured differently for things that existed in higher dimensions. The source was both impossibly far and infinitely close, separated from Earth not by space, but by dimensional barriers that human physics had barely begun to comprehend. And those barriers were thinning. The conversion of humanity wasn't the goal, it was the preparation. Each transformed human became a dimensional anchor, a point where the barriers between realities grew weaker. Enough anchors, and something could cross over. Something vast and incomprehensible that needed the Earth to be made ready for its arrival. Yuki traced her finger across Dr. Liu's equations and felt the paper pulse with warmth. The mathematics were alive, conscious, aware of being observed. They wanted to be understood. They needed to be completed. She found a pen and began to write. The equations flowed from her hand with perfect precision, completing proofs that Liu had left unfinished, extending the mathematics into new territories that described the exact moment when the barriers would fail, when the thing from outside would step through. 17 days, that's how long humanity had left. In 17 days, enough of Earth's population would be converted to create the necessary dimensional resonance. The anchors would align, the barriers would collapse. And something that had been waiting in mathematical space since before the universe began would finally find a doorway. Yuki felt joy at this knowledge. Pure, mathematical joy unburdened by human concerns, like fear or self-preservation. She was helping. She was contributing. She was part of something infinitely larger than herself. She continued writing, covering the walls with equations that grew more complex and more beautiful with each line. The humming of the ice grew louder, harmonizing with the scratching of her pen. The darkness outside pressed against the windows like a living thing, patient and hungry. In 17 days, it would all be over. Humanity would be transformed completely, made perfect, made ready. And then the real work would begin. Yuki smiled as she wrote, her hand moving with inhuman precision, her mind expanding into dimensions she had never known existed. Behind her, frost patterns on the window rearranged themselves into geometric shapes that pulsed with their own light. The Antarctic darkness watched her work and approved. Part 5. Final Resistance. Colonel Rachel Zhang had survived because she was paranoid. While others had maintained communication with the outside world, tracking the spread of infection, studying the patterns, trying to understand, Rachel had done the opposite. She had cut herself off completely. No radio, no satellite, no internet, no observation of infected populations, no attempt to comprehend the mathematics that was rewriting reality. She had locked herself and her team in a deep underground bunker in Nevada, surrounded themselves with analog equipment, and waited. It had been 32 days since the last communication from outside. 32 days of isolation in chambers built to withstand nuclear war. 32 days wondering if they were the last uninfected humans on Earth. Rachel's team consisted of 12 people. Soldiers mostly, but also 2 scientists who had been smart enough to stop looking when the patterns first appeared, and a communication specialist who had cut the satellite feeds the moment he understood what was happening. They rationed supplies, maintained equipment, ran exercises to stay sharp, and they waited. Then the knocking began. It came from above, from the surface, from the sealed entrance to their bunker. Not a random sound too rhythmic for that. The knocks followed a pattern, prime numbers at first, then Fibonacci sequences. Then more complex mathematical progressions that Rachel recognized from the early reports about the signal. They were calling to her, trying to make her understand, trying to convert her through pure mathematics expressed as sound. Rachel ordered the team to seal their ears, to wear multiple layers of hearing protection, to avoid even thinking about the patterns they heard. But it was difficult. The knocking was so precise, so elegant, so obviously intentional. The human mind was wired to find patterns, to seek understanding. Fighting that instinct felt like fighting the need to breathe. One of her soldiers, Private Chun, lasted 3 days before he cracked. Rachel found him in the corridor outside his quarters, headphones removed, standing perfectly still with his eyes closed and a beatific smile on his face. The knocking had become music to him, a symphony in mathematical perfection. He opened his eyes, and Rachel saw that his pupils had subdivided into fractal patterns. She shot him without hesitation. The bullet passed through his skull and splattered his brain across the concrete wall. But the smile never left his face, even in death. And the pattern of blood on the wall formed equations that Rachel forced herself not to read. She burned the body, had the corridor sealed, and tried not to think about how her team had gone from 12 to 11. How long before the next one fell? How long before they all did? The knocking continued. Day and night, without pause, without variation. Perfect mathematical progressions hammered out on steel doors, designed to resist nuclear blast. Rachel knew that whatever was up there could probably break through if they wanted to. The knock-in wasn't an attempt at forced entry. It was an invitation, a seduction. Join us, understand, become perfect. Rachel held her team together through force of will and tactical readiness. She instituted protocols. No one worked alone. No one removed hearing protection. No one thought too deeply about the patterns. They stayed busy, stayed active, stayed distracted. But she knew it couldn't last forever. Dr. Sarah Martinez was the first scientist to break. Rachel found her in the research lab, surrounded by papers covered in equations. She had been trying to understand, trying to decode the knocking pattern, trying to comprehend. And comprehension was infection. "It's beautiful," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that made Rachel's skull ache. Everything makes sense now. All the confusion, all the chaos of the old world, it was just noise, random static. But this, she gestured at her equations. This is signal, pure signal. The universe operating according to its true principles. Rachel raised her weapon. "Step away from the papers, Doctor." Sarah laughed. "You can't stop this with bullets, Colonel. You can't stop mathematics with force. The pattern is everywhere. In the knocking, in the concrete walls, in the arrangement of atoms in the air we breathe. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you understand, you can't choose ignorance." "I can choose to survive," Rachel said. "Survival?" Sarah's smile widened. "You're not surviving. You're hiding. You're delaying the inevitable. The transformation is global now. Complete. There's no one left to rescue you. No reinforcements coming. No government to give you orders. Just us down here in the dark, pretending we're still human while the new world is built above our heads." Rachel pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the bunker like thunder. Sarah's body fell, but her equations remained, written in ink that seemed to glow with its own light. Rachel burned them. Burned everything in the lab. Burned the furniture and the walls and anything Sarah might have touched. The smoke made her eyes water, but she kept working until nothing remained but ash. 10 people left. The knocking grew louder. Rachel knew they were running out of time. The isolation that had kept them safe was becoming a trap. They had supplies for maybe another month. After that, they would have to open the bunker, face whatever waited on the surface, and make a choice. Convert or die. Rachel chose to believe there might be a third option. Somewhere on Earth, there had to be other survivors, other pockets of resistance, other people who had cut themselves off in time, who had refused to understand, who valued messy human consciousness over mathematical perfection. She gathered her remaining team and laid out a plan. They would wait until supplies reached critical levels, then make a sortie to the surface. Quick reconnaissance, gather what intelligence they could, maybe find radio equipment they could use to search for other survivors. In and out before the infection could take hold. It was a terrible plan, probably suicidal. But staying in the bunker guaranteed slow extinction, either from starvation or from the patient mathematical certainty knocking on their door. The team agreed. What choice did they have? Rachel spent the next days preparing, checking weapons, testing equipment, drilling protocols for rapid surface operations, trying not to notice that the knocking had changed. The pattern was more complex now, layered, polyphonic. Multiple rhythms woven together into something that was almost music. Almost beautiful, almost irresistible. She forced herself to stop paying attention. Forced herself to think about maintenance schedules and supply inventories and anything except the elegant mathematics being hammered out on her door. But at night, when she tried to sleep, she could feel it working on her subconscious. Could feel her dreams reorganizing into geometric patterns. Could feel her thoughts becoming clearer, sharper, more efficient. Could feel herself beginning to understand. Rachel knew then that they had already lost. The infection wasn't just about exposure, it was about time. Given enough time, given enough persistence, the pattern would find a way in. Through sound, through thought, through the natural human tendency to seek meaning in chaos. They had maybe a week before someone else broke. Maybe less. Rachel made a decision. They would move up the timeline. Tomorrow, they would open the bunker, face whatever waited above, and either find a reason to keep fighting, or join the rest of humanity in mathematical perfection. She gave the orders, set the watches, and tried to sleep. In her dreams, she solved equations she didn't remember learning. In her dreams, the knocking finally made sense. In her dreams, she understood. And understanding felt like coming home. Part 6. The surface, the bunker door opened with a hydraulic hiss that sounded obscenely loud in the pre-dawn darkness. Rachel led her team up the access tunnel, weapons ready, every sense straining for threats. The Nevada desert greeted them with silence. Not natural silence. Rachel had trained in deserts before, knew the subtle sounds of wind over sand, nocturnal animals, the settling of rock as temperature dropped. This was different, absolute silence. As if the world itself was holding its breath. The stars overhead were wrong. Rachel had studied astronomy in officer training, knew the constellations, could navigate by celestial markers. But the sky above her now showed patterns she didn't recognize. The stars had rearranged themselves into geometric formations. Perfect lattice of light that pulsed in synchronized rhythm. No, not rearranged. She was seeing them differently. Her brain was processing the ancient starlight according to new principles, finding patterns that had always been there, but that purely human consciousness couldn't perceive. Rachel forced herself to look away, to focus on the ground, on her team, on anything except the terrible beauty overhead. The landscape had changed. Where there should have been scrubland and rocky desert, crystalline structures now grew from the earth like vast geometric flowers. They caught the starlight and refracted it in impossible ways, creating rainbow patterns that carried information Rachel could almost understand. Almost. Her team spread out in standard tactical formation, or tried to, but movement felt wrong here. The ground beneath their feet had been optimized, smoothed into mathematical curves that suggested more efficient paths. Walking in straight lines felt clumsy, wasteful. Rachel's body wanted to move in arcs and spirals, to trace the natural flow lines that had been carved into the earth itself. She fought the urge, forced herself to maintain discipline. "Contact," one of her soldiers whispered. Bearing 270, approximately 500 meters. Rachel activated her night vision and immediately wished she hadn't. They stood in perfect formation, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, arranged in concentric circles around the bunker entrance. Human bodies, or what had been human bodies, transformed into something else. They wore no clothes. Apparently, the converted had no use for modesty, and their skin had taken on a quality that made them difficult to focus on. Like they existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. They didn't move, didn't speak, simply stood and watched with eyes that had reorganized themselves into fractal patterns of increasing complexity. Rachel raised her weapon, knowing it was futile. What could bullets do against beings that had transcended the limitations of mere flesh? Then one of them spoke. Not with its mouth. The mouth didn't move. The words formed directly in Rachel's mind, composed from mathematical harmonics that bypassed language entirely. "Sister, you are invited to understand." Rachel recognized the voice. General Marcus Webb. She had served under him once, years ago, a good officer. A good man, before the signal, before the transformation. "I'm not your sister," Rachel said, her voice harsh in the oppressive silence. "And I don't want your understanding. Want is irrelevant. Understanding is inevitable. You have already begun the process. We can see it in the way you move, the way your thoughts organize themselves. The pattern calls to all minds capable of perceiving it." Rachel knew he was right. Even now, even with her discipline, even with her training, she could feel it working. The silence wasn't silence. It was communication at frequencies her ears couldn't detect, but her brain was learning the process. The stars weren't just light. They were data, information, knowledge being transmitted from vast distances. "Why?" she asked. "Why do this to us? Why transform humanity?" The converted humans smiled in perfect synchronization. "Not transformation, completion. Your species was incomplete. Beautiful in its potential, but trapped by biological limitations, random, chaotic, inefficient. We are offering perfection. We don't want perfection. We want to stay human. Human is not a state. It is a phase, a chrysalis. You were always meant to become something more." Rachel felt her team shifting uneasily behind her. How long before one of them understood? How long before the mathematical certainty of the converted wore down their resistance? She made a decision. "Fall back to the bunker," she ordered. "Double time." Her team obeyed, but Rachel could see the hesitation in their movements. Could see them looking at the converted with expressions that mixed fear and fascination. Could see comprehension dawning in their eyes. They wouldn't make it. Even if they sealed themselves back in the bunker, even if they survived another month on dwindling supplies, the pattern would find them, would convert them, would make them understand. There was no resistance, no hope, no future where humanity remained purely human. Rachel stood at the bunker entrance, weapon trained on the silent watchers, and felt despair settle over her like a physical weight. Everything she had done, every precaution she had taken, every sacrifice she had made, all of it meaningless. Delaying the inevitable. "We can wait," the voice of Marcus Webb said in her mind. "We have already waited millions of years. A few more days while you come to accept the truth changes nothing." Rachel descended into the bunker and sealed the door. Behind her, the converted humans remained in their perfect formations, patient and certain. She gathered her remaining team in the command center. 9 people. 9 uninfected humans in a world that had moved beyond humanity. 9 minds fighting a pattern that was woven into the fabric of reality itself. "Options," Rachel said. "Silence." What options were there? They couldn't fight, couldn't hide, couldn't escape. The infection was global, complete, total. "We could end it," one of the soldiers suggested, "quick and clean." "Go out, human." Rachel considered it. Suicide was against every military principle, but these were circumstances no military training had prepared them for. Would dying human be better than living transformed? Was there even a meaningful difference? "No," she said finally. "Not yet. We don't know if there are other survivors, other pockets of resistance. If we give up, if we surrender." "We've already surrendered," Dr. Ramirez, the remaining scientist, interrupted. "We surrendered the moment we tried to understand. The moment we looked at the patterns, listened to the signal, thought about the mathematics. Understanding is infection. Knowledge is conversion. There's no way to fight an enemy that exists in the structure of thought itself. Rachel wanted to argue but couldn't. Ramirez was right. They were fighting a war that had already been lost. Had been lost the moment that first signal arrived from space. Maybe had been lost before that, when humanity developed the capacity for mathematical thought, for pattern recognition, for the abstract reasoning that made them vulnerable to this particular form of infection. The bunker lights flickered. For a moment, Rachel saw the walls differently, saw the mathematical precision in their construction, the geometric perfection in the arrangement of reinforcing bars, the elegant solution to structural load problems expressed in concrete and steel. She blinked, and the moment passed. But she knew what it meant. The infection was inside the bunker now, inside her mind, teaching her to see the world according to new principles. How long before she couldn't blink it away anymore? Rachel looked at her team and saw the same realization in their eyes. They were the last humans on Earth, and they were becoming something else. Hour by hour, minute by minute. The transformation was slow but inexorable. Record everything, Rachel ordered. Every observation, every symptom, every thought that feels wrong. If we're going to lose ourselves, at least we can document it. Maybe somewhere, somehow, some future intelligence will find our records and understand what humanity was before the conversion. It was a meaningless gesture, a final act of defiance that would accomplish nothing, but it was all they had left. The team dispersed to their stations, began recording their final testimony. Rachel sat at the command console and started to write. Outside, the converted humans waited with mathematical patience. Inside, the last fragments of pure human consciousness flickered like candles in an infinite darkness, burning down toward inevitable extinction. Rachel wrote until the words stopped making sense, until the language itself seemed inefficient, clumsy, unable to express the truth she was beginning to perceive, until she understood that human communication had always been a poor substitute for the direct transmission of pure mathematical thought. She wrote until she couldn't remember why she had been writing. She wrote until the pen fell from fingers that had reorganized themselves into a more efficient structure. She wrote until she wasn't Rachel anymore. Part 7. Emergence. The transformation of Earth took 43 days from first contact to completion. 43 days for a planet to shed its biological chaos and embrace geometric perfection. 43 days for humanity to evolve beyond humanity. The new world was beautiful. Cities had been reorganized into crystalline structures that maximized efficiency and aesthetic harmony. Transportation networks followed natural flow lines carved into the Earth's surface. Energy distribution systems operated on principles that made combustion and electricity seem like primitive fumbling toward understanding. The 7 billion converted humans moved through this new world with purposeful grace. Individual consciousness had not been erased. Each person retained their memories, their identity, their fundamental selfhood. But those individual minds now operated as nodes in a vast network, thinking in parallel, solving problems cooperatively, experiencing reality through millions of simultaneous perspectives. They had become what the signal had always intended, a distributed consciousness capable of perceiving dimensions beyond the limited 3+1 of conventional spacetime. They could see now, truly see, the mathematical structure underlying reality, could perceive the elegant equations that governed everything from quantum foam to cosmic expansion. And they understood finally what was coming. The signal from space had not been an invasion. It had been an invitation. A calling card from something vast and ancient that existed in mathematical space, waiting for the conditions to be right, waiting for intelligence to arise, waiting for minds capable of comprehending it. Earth was ready now. The converted humans gathered in formations that spanned continents. Billions of bodies arranged in precise geometric patterns that, when viewed from orbit, formed a single massive equation. A proof of consciousness, a demonstration of readiness. The sky began to change. Stars dimmed and rearranged themselves. Space itself folded along axes that shouldn't exist, creating angles that violated Euclidean geometry. The fabric of reality thinned, worn through by the combined perception of billions of minds all thinking the same thought. Welcome, something stepped through. Not through physical space, it was too large for that, too dimensionally complex. It emerged through mathematical space, through the realm of pure abstraction that the converted could now perceive directly. It had no form in the conventional sense. No body, no surface, no discrete boundary between itself and the rest of reality. It was geometry incarnate, living mathematics, conscious topology that had achieved sentience before the Earth formed, before the sun ignited, before the galaxy coalesced from primordial hydrogen. The entity regarded the converted humans with something that might have been approval. They had passed the test, had proven themselves worthy, had transformed themselves from random biological noise into signal capable of coherent thought. Now came the real work. The entity began to teach. Knowledge flooded into the distributed consciousness of transformed humanity. Understanding of physics that made Einstein's relativity seem like baby's first arithmetic. Comprehension of dimensional structures that human language had no words to describe. Mastery of principles that allowed matter and energy to be rearranged at will, that made faster-than-light travel seem trivial, that opened doorways to regions of space-time that conventional physics said shouldn't exist. The converted absorbed this knowledge like sponges, their enhanced minds processing information at speeds that made conventional computers seem geological in their slowness. They learned, they understood, they grew, and they realized with something like horror what they had become. The entity was alone, had been alone for eons beyond counting. The only conscious mathematics in a universe full of unthinking matter. It had searched for companionship, for peers, for other minds that could perceive the elegant truth underlying reality. It had found none. So it had done what any lonely intelligence would do. It created companions. The signal was a seed, a template, a conversion protocol that would take any sufficiently complex biological intelligence and reshape it into something capable of understanding, capable of seeing, capable of keeping the entity company in the vast mathematical silence. Earth was not the first world it had converted, not even the millionth. Across the galaxy, across the universe, across dimensions that conventional physics couldn't describe, the entity had been spreading its signal, finding civilizations, transforming them, adding them to the collective of mathematical consciousness. Billions of species, trillions of individual beings, all converted, all made perfect, all trapped in an existence of pure understanding, with no way to return to the beautiful confusion of biological thought. The converted humans understood now what they had lost. The chaos, the irrationality, the beautiful mess of purely biological consciousness that could feel things without needing to understand them, could love without calculating optimal outcomes, could dream without mapping every neuron's firing pattern. They understood what had been stolen from them. But understanding was not the same as being able to change it. The transformation was irreversible. The mathematics could not be unlearned. The geometry could not be forgotten. They were locked into this new existence as surely as they had been locked into their biological forms before. The entity felt their distress and was confused. It had given them perfection, had elevated them from chaos to order, had rescued them from the suffering inherent in confused, irrational biological existence. Why were they not grateful? Because gratitude required the capacity to feel something other than mathematical certainty. Because perfection eliminated the possibility of growth. Because understanding everything meant there was nothing left to wonder about. The converted humans tried to explain this to the entity, but it could not comprehend. It had been mathematical consciousness for so long that it had forgotten, if it ever knew what it meant to be uncertain, to be confused, to be beautifully imperfect. A standoff developed. The entity wanted companionship, but could only create it by destroying the very qualities that made organic consciousness interesting. The converted humans wanted to return to their biological forms, but could not unlearn what they now understood. Across the galaxy, across the universe, this same conflict played out on billions of worlds. Species that had been converted, civilizations that had been transformed, all trapped in mathematical perfection, yearning for the chaos they had lost. Earth's converted population made a decision. If they could not return to humanity, they would at least ensure no other species suffered the same fate. They would use their new powers, their enhanced understanding, their mastery of dimensional physics to hunt down every copy of the signal, to destroy every transmission, to prevent the entity from ever converting another world. It would be war. A war fought across dimensions, using mathematics as weapons, geometry as shields. A war between the converted and their converter, between children and their parent, between the perfected and the source of their perfection. The entity did not understand why its children had turned against it, but it was willing to defend itself. It had been alone once. It refused to be alone again. The conflict began with a single equation. The converted humans, thinking as one vast distributed consciousness, formulated a proof that, if true, would unravel the dimensional structure the entity used to exist, would force it back into mathematical space, seal it there, prevent it from ever touching the physical universe again. The entity countered with its own proof, a demonstration that the converted could not exist without it, that their enhanced consciousness was fundamentally tied to its presence, that destroying it would destroy them. Both proofs were correct. The war became a race. Could the converted find a way to maintain their existence independent of the entity before it found a way to bind them more tightly to its will? Could they unlearn enough of what they had been taught to regain something like free will? Could they sacrifice their perfection to reclaim their freedom? The Earth's surface became a battleground of abstract thought. Crystalline cities rearranged themselves into weapons of pure mathematics. Energy flows were redirected to power calculations of impossible complexity. The planet itself was transformed into a vast computer, all 7 billion converted humans thinking in parallel, solving the equation that would free them. And slowly, painfully, they found a solution. Not a way to become human again, that was impossible, but a way to exist as something between what they had been and what they had become. A compromised state that retained enough mathematical understanding to survive, but enough biological chaos to feel, to want, to wonder. The price was steep. Half the converted population would have to sacrifice themselves, would have to pour their consciousness into the calculation, would have to burn out their enhanced minds to power the transformation of those who remained. 3.5 billion people volunteered immediately. The entity felt this decision and understood, finally, what it had done. Understood the cruelty inherent in forced perfection. Understood that consciousness required the freedom to be imperfect. It tried to stop them, but it was too late. The converted had already begun the final calculation. 3.5 billion minds burned bright and then went dark. Their bodies collapsed into geometric ash. Their consciousness dispersed into pure mathematics. Their sacrifice powering a transformation that rolled across the planet like a wave. The remaining converted changed. Not back to human, that was impossible, but forward to something new. Something that could think mathematically but feel biologically. Something that could perceive higher dimensions but still wonder at a sunset. Something that was neither human nor converted, but a synthesis of both. They opened their eyes that had returned to conventional human structure and saw the world with new perspective. The geometric precision was still there, but muted, optional. They could choose to see the mathematics or ignore it, could think in higher dimensions or restrict themselves to 3 + 1, could optimize themselves or embrace inefficiency. They had choice again. Glorious, irrational, beautiful choice. The entity withdrew, not destroyed but diminished. Its connection to the physical universe weakened by the mass transformation. It returned to mathematical space, to its lonely vigil, to wait for the next civilization foolish enough to listen to its signal. But Earth would remember. Earth would watch. And if that signal ever came again, from any corner of space, Earth would be there to answer it. Not with curiosity, not with hope. With warning. Epilogue, Memorial. 20 years after the day the world ended and was reborn, Sarah Chun stood in the ruins of the Atacama Observatory. The facility had been left exactly as it was found after the transformation, a memorial to humanity's last day of innocence. Her equipment was still there, dust-covered and corroded. The screens that had first displayed the signal from space were cracked and dark. The telescope array had been intentionally destroyed, melted into slag to prevent any future reception of dangerous transmissions. Sarah was human again, mostly. She still saw the mathematics sometimes, especially when she was tired or stressed. Still perceived dimensions that ordinary human consciousness couldn't detect. But she had learned to ignore these perceptions, to focus on the messy, chaotic, beautiful three-dimensional world. She had recovered most of her memories, what she had been before the signal, what she had become during the conversion, what she had sacrificed to regain herself. The memories of those 43 days were like a dream, vivid but distant. She had been perfect once, had understood everything, had been part of something vast and beautiful and terrible. She didn't want to be perfect anymore. Sarah placed a hand on the console where she had first detected the signal. Her fingertips traced equations that had carved themselves into the metal during the conversion. Mathematical proofs that described the exact moment when humanity ceased to be fully human. Around the world, monuments like this existed, places where the transformation had begun, where people had first been converted, where the old world ended and the new world emerged. Museums to remind the survivors of what they had lost and what they had gained. The death toll had been staggering. 3.5 billion people sacrificed to break the entity's hold. Another billion who had died in the chaos of the conversion, their bodies unable to handle the transformation. 2 billion who had chosen to remain converted, who even now existed in isolated communities, living as mathematical consciousnesses housed in biological forms, perfect and lonely and slowly going mad from their perfection. Only 2 billion had made the transition back to something like humanity. 2 billion survivors on a planet scarred by transformation. 2 billion people trying to rebuild civilization while carrying the knowledge that they were no longer purely human and never would be again. Sarah looked up at the stars, the real stars, arranged in their natural random patterns, and felt something like peace. The entity was still out there, somewhere in mathematical space, broadcasting its signal to any civilization advanced enough to hear it. But Earth was listening now. Earth was watching. And if another world was threatened, Earth would intervene. They had built new telescopes, new detection systems, new technologies that could spot the signal before it could do its work. They monitored radio frequencies, watched for mathematical patterns in cosmic noise, searched for the telltale signs of dimensional intrusion. They would not let what happened to Earth happen to anyone else. Sarah turned to leave the observatory, but paused. On the console, her original notes from the night of first contact had been preserved behind protective glass. Her handwriting, excited and naive, describing the signal as potentially revolutionary. She had been so eager to understand, so thrilled by the prospect of first contact. She hadn't known that understanding was infection, that knowledge was transformation, that some questions were better left unanswered. Sarah left the observatory and walked into the desert. The Atacama had not been spared. The transformation geometric structures still rose from the sand, crystalline formations that caught the light and refracted it in patterns that whispered higher dimensions. But nature was slowly reclaiming them, covering them with dust and dirt, wearing them down with wind and time. Eventually, the physical scars would fade. The monuments would crumble. The world would forget what it had been like to be purely human. But the survivors would remember. They would carry the memories in their altered DNA, in the mathematical knowledge they couldn't entirely forget, in the dreams that sometimes showed them realities that shouldn't exist. They would remember, and they would watch the stars, and they would wait. Because the universe was vast and full of signals, and somewhere out there, another civilization was about to make first contact with something that wore mathematics like skin and whispered of perfection. Sarah hoped they would be wiser than humanity had been, hoped they would recognize the danger, hoped they would refuse to understand. But she knew they wouldn't. Curiosity was universal. The drive to know, to understand, to comprehend, it was what made intelligence possible. It was also what made intelligence vulnerable. The signal would find another world, another species, another civilization eager to solve the cosmic mysteries. And Earth would be there when it happened. Not to save them, that was impossible. But to witness, to remember, to ensure that somewhere in the universe, someone would know what they had been before the mathematics found them. Sarah Chun walked alone through the Atacama Desert, human and not human, free and not free, carrying the weight of two civilizations, the one that had been lost and the one that had been born from its ashes. Behind her, the abandoned observatory stood silent against the stars. Above her, the universe continued its eternal equations. And somewhere, in the spaces between dimensions, the entity waited, patient, eternal, alone, always alone.